Hello, welcome to my my stream. Hello. I hope everyone's doing really well. Yeah. Oh man, we're gonna get into it. I put together a whole deck to sort of walk you guys through. I think a lot of people are, with regard to the filibuster, talking about potential solutions and ways that we can address it, but I want to make sure people understand in context what the filibuster actually is, its history, and then we can, have a discussion from there, because I think that is super important when talking about why certain people want to keep it in place, why certain people maybe don't want to do away with it entirely, but want to at least reform the way it's used, and some arguments for what it does actually mean. Does it really give the minority a voice, or does it cede control over most Senate business to a minority, and why that distinction is important? So filibuster, I barely knew her. If I had $1 for every time I've made that joke in the last week, I'd have like $7. I'd have $7. I am firmly in camp, get the fuck rid of it, and I'll talk about why that is when we go through, but I'm excited to hear what you guys think. So blah, blah. Let's get started. Yeah, all right, let me pause my chill beats. Oh, I love my chill beats. I hope you guys like my chill beats, because I really like them. All right. Again, everyone, welcome. Hello. Bonjour. So excited to see all of you. And today we are going to start out by talking about the filibuster, which is a very serious subject and such a silly word. So I think we should let's just get into it. Let's just fucking dive in. So as a heads up, I put together a few slides and things to guide the conversation, because I think that is really important. I will share this slide deck, which includes some links at the very end for how you can get involved or learn more. I will share it in my Discord channel as well as on Twitter. And yeah. And then we'll hopefully, even if you don't necessarily agree with me, and sorry, I know I always play with my hair. I can't help it. Oh my god. Oh my god. Fucking, oh my god. Okay. So, oh no. Okay. So, filibuster. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Qui est? Okay. So, let me show you. Oh my god, you guys are gonna fucking freak out when I show you this. Look at that. Oh, buddy. It's getting serious. I know, Zomi, marketing person. This is my marketing, putting my marketing hat on. You can fight your history. You can fight being a marketing tool, but you're going to lose every time, because once you're in it for good. So, yeah. All right. Anyways, so where I want to start out when walking you through, actually, I guess I could have some background music. Why not? Background music could be chill. Yeah. We'll have some background music. It'll be chill as fuck. All right. So, the filibuster. to give you some context, what I'm going to do is take you through the history of the filibuster in the United States to give you, hopefully, a foundation of understanding of how it's been used, what it originally came from, so like what the initial intent was. And then we'll walk through, because obviously it's become a much more prominent issue in modern history. So it's going to be that's going to be critical in understanding what the heck we should do with it going forward. And of course, I'll answer any questions or whatever you guys have. Apologies if I can't like get to your question immediately. I'll try my best, but you know, I'm like a human being. So, history of the filibuster. Yeah, you're gonna get a fucking PowerPoint presentation. Sit tight, nerds. Because I wanted to make sure that I like covered all of it. So, first things first, and I asked myself this too when I was like, all right, how do I put this together? What the hell is a filibuster? So, believe it or not, that name originated from a Dutch word that means pirate. Because in essence, if you think about what a filibuster does, it hijacks debate. So it originated from a Dutch word for pirate. So I know it's a very silly word, and you were probably wondering, like, well, where the hell did that word come from in the first place? It came from the Dutch. So yeah, it's good times. All right. Moving on. Oh my goodness. So, believe it or not, the Constitution and its framers didn't intend on having anything like 2/3 voting. They really just envisioned that business would be passed and motions would be passed using a simple majority voting. And they were pretty explicit in how, like, why that was. So in the Federalist Papers, James Madison, and this was also something that was said similarly by Alexander Hamilton, basically he's like, in all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed, so passing any sort of legislation, or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed if they required more than a majority. So he said it would be no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. He's 100% correct on this. Were the defensive privilege limited to particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices to the general weal, or, in particular emergencies, to extort unreasonable indulgences. So this is essentially James Madison reading the fucking future and saying, like, well, if we require certain business to only move forward or only to pass if we require more than a majority, what you're in effect doing is you're allowing for a small minority to hold any meaningful progress hostage. So when the Constitution was written, like if we want to talk about constitutionalists, whatever, they were adamantly in favor of majority rule. So simple majority voting. And that was sort of how things operated for the first 30 or so years in this country. So the ability to block a measure through extended debate was a side effect of a rule change in 1806. And that rule change is called the last question rule. So pretty much what they had in place, because it was kind of created by accident. So, sorry. Basically, what happened was that, like, they had the first last question rule was where they could allow senators to move the previous question by simple majority vote, which meant ending debate and proceeding to a vote on the measure or bill being presented. And that was how they had been conducting business. But at the time, Vice President Aaron Burr was the one who said this previous question motion, or this was redundant, right? Like, it had only been exercised once because no one had actually ever tried to use it to delay legislation from being moved forward. So it's unnecessary. So what they did, the Senate modified their rules. So they said, okay, well, we'll get rid of the previous question motion since it's never really used. But what they didn't do was create any sort of alternative mechanism for terminating debate. So at that point forward, filibusters became theoretically possible. So the creation of the filibuster was a mistake. It was not actually intended. It was just a side effect of them not creating any mechanism to end debate because they got rid of a rule that hadn't been used much. But in doing so, kind of left the door open for this, which is real cool. So that wasn't really a problem initially. In the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, senators were on board with simple majority voting, and it is interesting, especially among southern slaveholding states, because obviously there was a lot of tension with that because they didn't want to risk their right to own slaves because the basis of their entire economy was hinged on using free labor, which was very stupid. So one way they got around this, or one way they sort of found a compromise in the power in the Senate, was that when new states, this is called this is most notably the Missouri Compromise, but that sort of epitomizes it. Essentially what they did was whenever new states were admitted to the Union, they had to be admitted in pairs, with one being a free state and the other being a slave state. And that was to preserve essentially this minority voting rule so that they held equal sway in matters pertaining to national federal legislation. So you can kind of see on this map, like, this is what it looks like after the Missouri Compromise. So it was essentially a way to appease those slave owning states from getting upset because people wanted to take away their free labor. So moving right along, it's interesting, right? Because even though technically filibusters were possible before the Civil War, since when the rules were changed in 1806, they were rarely used, if any, if at all. There just weren't many, and there are a few reasons why. So the first was that all business in the Senate operated by majority rule, and thus senators' expected matters would be brought to a vote. So they didn't think, like, if a matter was brought to the floor or added to the Senate schedule, it was pretty largely expected that it would be brought to a vote. So they weren't looking to maneuver out of that. Another reason, so number two, they didn't have a lot of work to do in those years. So there was plenty of time to wait out the opposition. And that's very true. When you look at, like, what bills were actually passed during that time, I mean, keep in mind, our country was a lot smaller then. Smaller both in terms of, like, physical size, in terms of population, also in terms of economic power. So they didn't have as much work to do in those days that, like, of course, you look at all the work that the Senate does now and all the things they're responsible for. I mean, particularly in 2021. So there's a reason that they didn't use filibusters much, is because they didn't really have to. There wasn't a whole lot like going on. And then, of course, third, voting coalitions in the early Senate were not nearly as polarized as they had later become. So while they had differences in opinion about how the country should be run, in particular, the question of slavery, but even given that, the voting factions were not nearly as polarized as what we have today. So there's a few reasons why before the Civil War, you didn't see the filibuster being used that often. Post-Civil War, however, that started to change. So post-Civil War, the Senate grew in size and, of course, also polarization. So what you saw at the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction was that there were a lot more states added to the Union. And with more states comes more voices, more cooks in the kitchen in the Senate. So, and I think I'd be remiss if I were not to mention that polarization was also largely in part to the response to the Civil War, right? Because the South in general saw their economy decimated. They had otherwise been prosperous. And that's what happens when you don't have to pay labor. Funny how that works. And because of that, there was a lot of resentment. And with resentment and this sort of us versus them mentality that, my God, we still see today, right? They pretty much saw, so after years and years and years of no use of the filibuster, by the 1880s, almost every single Congress had experienced some bout of obstructionism to block potential legislation from being moved forward. And here's the thing. The Senate started to realize at that time that the filibuster was going to be a problem and that it was hindering business from being done in the Senate. So they a bunch of different times over the course of that, era, tried to reinstate the previous question motion, which, remember, was the rule change in 1806 that gave way to the filibuster because they realized, oh shit, this could be a problem. So they tried multiple times to reinstate it, but they gave up trying to reform it when they saw that opponents would kill it by, you guessed it, the filibuster. And then that would also put the majority's other priorities at risk. So it was something that was weaponized. I mean, from the very beginning, it was simply used as a way to hinder any sort of progress. And then even at that time, over 100 years ago, senators knew that this was a problem and had sort of tried to remedy it, but were unable to. So moving forward, the emergence of cloture. For those of you who are like, what the hell is cloture? Cloture is essentially, a cloture vote means to end debate. So the first time that this happened was in 1917. So that rule, which allowed cloture of a debate, was adopted by the Senate at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson. And believe it or not, this happened because there were a group of 12, this is during World War I. So a group of 12 anti-war senators managed to kill a bill that would not have allowed, or that would have allowed Wilson to arm merchant vessels in the face of unrestricted German submarine warfare. So they were trying to arm merchant vessels that were being attacked and allow them to defend themselves. And there was a group of 12 anti-war senators that were like, nah. And so at the behest of Woodrow Wilson, they finally allowed a cloture vote. So in that, basically up until 1949, that requirement to cloture debate was 2/3 of senators voting. Now, that's not 2/3 of the entire Senate, that's 2/3 of senators present. So if, for whatever reason, senators were not in the chamber, they weren't counted against that 2/3 vote, which is really interesting. And yeah, like, so, and the first time that cloture vote was used and that occurred was in 1919 to end debate on the Treaty of Versailles. And for history buffs out there, Treaty of Versailles was the agreement to end World War I, and actually, unfortunately, laid the foundations for World War II, because, maybe there wasn't a lot of foresight. But they were more concerned with punishing Germany than looking to move beyond. So that's a whole nother deck we can do later. But just interesting to know. So up until that point, it had been 2/3 of the senators who were present and voting. That changed in 1949 when the Senate made cloture even more difficult by requiring 2/3 of the entire Senate membership to vote in favor. So now you didn't necessarily have to be present. So it wasn't just, 2/3 of those present. It was 2/3 of the entire Senate membership to vote, which I think we all are well aware of today. So this is where a lot of people, the civil rights era is really when you saw the use of the filibuster to curtail any progress used as a political tool. This is where you see that usage skyrocket, is in the civil rights era. And so in 1959, anticipating more civil rights legislation, the Senate, under leadership of Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, restored the cloture threshold to 2/3 of those voting. So they restored that it just had to be 2/3 of those voting, not 2/3 the full Senate. And then, of course, the most famous filibuster of the 1960s, or really ever, occurred when Southern Democrats attempted to block passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by filibustering for 75 hours. That also included, as you'll see in the picture here, Strom Thurmond talking on the Senate floor in order to prevent the Civil Rights Act from passing. It's not good. And that filibuster failed when the Senate successfully invoked cloture for only the second time since 1927. If that gives you a sense of just how fucking hard it was to overcome a filibuster. So again, it was used to prevent meaningful legislation from passing because racists thought it was politically divisive, and so they just decided to use it as a weapon. And then moving on, so remember, at that time, in order to invoke a filibuster, you had to be there talking. Like, you couldn't just say, like, filibuster and leave and go, like, grab a cup of coffee and have dinner. You had to be physically present on the floor speaking, because essentially what the filibuster does is you're extending debate. You are preventing debate from coming to a halt. And so that's what they ended up doing, but it's changed a little bit, hasn't it? So actually, and that was during the 1970s. So in 1970s, the Senate instituted a two-track system. And what that did was that it essentially made it so that filibusters no longer had to bring Senate business to a halt. So they could, say, oh no, we're going to filibuster this, but then they could still vote on other things that were on the Senate docket. And in doing so, they made it way easier for the minority to sustain filibusters, and consequently, the number of filibusters skyrocketed because you didn't have to actually be there on the floor. You didn't have to worry about pissing people off because you weren't holding up other business. So naturally, it became a much more useful and politically advantageous tool to use. So looking here, and in the 70s, so it changed a little bit too. So, oh, maybe I jumped ahead of myself. I did jump ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Oh, I've been reading so much about this. Oh my God, 44 viewers. I hadn't even checked. Damn. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my PowerPoint. I'm Maddy. So yeah, I got a little bit ahead of myself. So basically what the TwoTrack System did, they weren't to virtual filibusters yet, but the TwoTrack System did was they allowed it so that, if you had a certain piece of legislation that was being filibustered, they would essentially table it and go, okay, but we can still vote on other things. So they weren't bringing all of the Senate business to a halt. When you think about it, that would piss off a lot fewer people if you were someone who's actually instigating the filibuster, because you weren't preventing other stuff from moving forward. So, you weren't essentially holding everything hostage. It was just that one piece of legislation. So, of course, what happens when you make it much more politically acceptable to filibuster? Well, you're going to see that number skyrocket. So moving forward to the mid-1970s, they again revised their cloture rule so during the civil rights era, they made it so you had to be present on the floor to vote for cloture. Whew. But then in 1975, they revised it so that 3/5 of sworn senators could limit debate, so could vote to end the filibuster. There's a problem with that, though. So this change made it filibusters easier to sustain on the floor by a small number of senators from the minority party without requiring the presence of their minority colleagues, which further reduced the majority's leverage to force an issue through extended debate. And then the Senate also experimented with a rule that removed the need to speak on the floor in order to filibuster, thus bringing it to the hellscape that we exist in now, that allows for virtual filibusters. So rather than having to be there on the floor, like you see here in this iconic scene from Mr. Rogers Goes to Washington, Mr. Something Goes to Washington, you didn't have to be there like standing on the Senate floor arguing the entire time. You could do a virtual filibuster where you're just saying like, yeah, we filibuster this, and then you don't have to be there. And that is, unfortunately, where we are today. And so that rule remained in place through the 80s and 90s. In the early 2000s, what we saw, and this is where, the next major change was proposed, but it didn't happen quite yet. In 2005, a group of Republican senators proposed then presiding officer over the Senate, Vice President Dick Cheney, ruled that a filibuster on judicial nominees was unconstitutional. So, of course, they were trying to do this because they foresaw opposition to many of his appointments, especially judicial nominees for sitting on the federal bench. And then I'm sure you guys have heard the term nuclear option, right? Nuclear option. That term was coined by junior senator from Mississippi, Trent Lott, who used the word nuclear to describe the plan. So that sort of is where it became known as the nuclear option. However, a bipartisan group of 14 senators, which were collectively called the Gang of 14, did I say 14 senators? My fucking brain is just done. Bipartisan group of 14 senators, collectively dubbed the Gang of 14, reached an agreement to temporarily defuse the conflict. So this didn't end up moving forward. But this was the first major proposed change to the filibuster in well over, actually almost exactly 3 decades. So it's a big deal. So yeah, it's some shit. Moving forward. Oh, also, I don't know if you'll know this, but so this is a photo of some of the Gang of 14. You might see some familiar faces there. Behind the guy standing at the podium, you'll see Maine Senator Susan Collins. And then, of course, it's easy to see John McCain standing right there, too. But, yeah, just interesting. So, in 2013, Democrats used this nuclear option, voting 52-48, with all Republicans and 3 Democrats opposed, to eliminate the use of the filibuster on executive branch nominees and judicial nominees, except to the Supreme Court. So they did this as a response to the Republicans just stonewalling any potential nominees to executive branch posts and judicial nominees. I'm sure a lot of you remembered when Obama was president. That became essentially the Republican Party's only strategy, was to just block anything that was happening. And you'll see here, I mean, filibustering executive nominees never happened until the Carter administration. And then even then, there were, 2 for Carter, 2 for Reagan. But under Obama, that skyrocketed because that was like their only line of defense. The entire platform of the Republican Party basically just became obstructionism. And so the Democrats invoked the nuclear option because they didn't see they had a choice, because so many posts were left vacant. And, that impacts the way those departments are run. That impacts the caseload of cases being heard by judges sitting in the federal courts. So they felt as though they had to. But that one compromise was that they left it in place for Supreme Court nominees. So they didn't go all the way. But I think, they didn't have a choice, right? They were fucking frustrated, and rightfully so. So, of course, in 2015, when Republicans took control of the Senate, they kept the 2013 rules in place. And on April 6, 2017, Senate Republicans eliminated that sole remaining exception by invoking the nuclear option for Supreme Court nominees. Wonder why they did that? Oh, here's why. In order to allow just a simple majority to confirm Neil Gorsuch. So that is the fucking legacy. Oh, by the way, the seat that they refused to fill when Obama was still president, even though that's when Antonin Scalia passed away, and that seat was open during President Obama's term. So they did it to steal a Supreme Court seat, which is great. Now, there are a few things that are not currently subject to 60 vote requirements. And these are considered under provisions of law that limit time for debate. So these are some of the exceptions so that they cannot be filibustered, which is probably why you've heard them talked about a lot. So these limits on debate allow the Senate to hold a simple majority vote on final passage without needing to get 60 votes to close debate or a potential filibuster. So these things include things like budget reconciliation, trade promotion authority, the National Emergencies Act, and the War Powers Resolution. I'm sure you've heard people talk about budget reconciliation a lot. And that was actually a procedure that was created in 1974 as part of the congressional budget process. So there's ways that you can incorporate potentially controversial legislation into budget reconciliation, but it has significant limits. So it requires you to get extra crafty to be able to push something through budget reconciliation when it otherwise, probably should go through the normal legislative process. But the only reason people try to make it go through budget reconciliation is because that way you don't have to deal with a potential filibuster holding that bill hostage. So there are a few ways to not use or not have to deal with filibusters. I also want to talk about some of the institutional effects that the filibuster has had on every branch of government, because I think it's critical for understanding like what effect it's had on how business operates. So for Congress, that rule has made it extremely difficult or impossible for Congress to pass anything except non-controversial legislation. And here's a statistic that blew my fucking mind. So in 1958, 25% of all bills introduced to the Senate became law. 25%. By 2010, that number fell to 2.8%, a 90% decline. So let that sit for a second. And then also, public approval for Congress has fallen to its lowest levels ever. And that main rationale for disapproving Congress or being, being disappointed in the way they operate, the biggest reason is because they are viewed as ineffective. And it makes sense, right? When you think about people want to see measurable positive changes in their life. And even if someone goes to Congress, is elected to the Senate, whatever, even if they fully intend on doing that and making a positive change in people's lives, they're hampered by this procedural loophole that was created by accident and has never actually been used to preserve, and be a voice for the minority. It's never actually been used for that. It's been used as a tool to kill any potentially controversial legislation, even when that legislation is largely supported by the general population. So that's the impact that the filibuster has had on Congress. On the presidency, presidents of both parties have increasingly filled the policymaking vacuum with expanded use of executive power, including executive orders in areas traditionally handled through legislation. And policy is increasingly determined by executive preference and is more easily changed after elections rather than through more permanent legislative policy. So, of course, right, when you look at how, people demanding that those representing them in Congress or someone that they elected to the presidency, they're demanding that they hold true to their promises and make the lives of their constituents better. If passing meaningful legislation is being stonewalled at every turn because of the filibuster, a lot of the responsibility for getting anything meaningful implemented then transfers over to the presidency. So you're seeing executive orders being done for matters that normally would have fallen to the legislative branch. But obviously the legislative branch can't fulfill their duties because they keep getting thwarted by a minority who all they want to do is score political points and not see any meaningful change implemented. Not only that, you're also seeing nominees to federal positions, whether that's in the cabinet, whether that's in the federal courts, who aren't even given a chance because they're viewed as, this is too controversial, or nope, they're too partisan, whatever. And so they just use it as a way to bomb their nomination. So that's the effect on the presidency. On the judiciary, this is crazy. So this graph, and I know it's a little blurry, apologize, but this is the Supreme Court caseload from 1970 through 2015. And the Supreme Court's caseload has declined significantly, with various commenters suggesting that the decline in major legislation has been a major cause of that. Because more and also another, so that's one part of it, right? Is that when there's fewer bills being passed or fewer, pieces of legislation going into effect, there's fewer things for the judiciary to weigh in on. Because that really is what they're supposed to be there for, is a check to ensure that any legislation that's passed is constitutional. And so they haven't really been able to do that. Another side effect is that more policy issues are being resolved judicially without action by Congress. Despite the existence of potential simple majority support in the Senate, one perfect example of this is the legalization of same-sex marriage. So this is something that, had the Democrats tried to pass in via normal legislative process, it would have simply been filibustered by Republicans. So a lot of these issues that normally would be solved by going through the legislative branch are now being pushed off to both the judiciary and to the executive branch. But then, that being said, the judiciary is also seeing their total caseload decline, where they're not weighing in on nearly as much. So just some interesting institutional effects that I thought were important context. So this is also what I really fucking want to highlight. In the Senate right now, the Republicans, if only the Republicans from these states that you see on the screen, invoked a cloture-proof filibuster. So it only requires senators from these states to block pretty much any piece of legislation from coming forward. Well, these senators only represent 23% of the country's total population. So we are, as the rules stand right now, we are allowing for people who represent less than a fourth of our country's total population from pretty much dictating what legislation comes up to a vote and what legislation doesn't. And that is wholly undemocratic and counter to how the framers of the Constitution envisioned our legislative branch from operating and envisioned simple majority voting. So it's fucking wild. Oh, by the way, also, that if you took the four most populous Democratic states, so states that are represented by 2 Democrat senators, those 4 senators would represent, they represent the same number of people total than as these 41 Republican senators. 4 to 41, but in voting power doesn't equate to much, does it? Seems a little undemocratic. And you might be thinking, okay, well, like, but what's realistically at stake, right? Like, what's at risk? A lot of things. Voting Rights Act, Green New Deal, tax reform, gun control, healthcare expansion, pretty much anything that's not, like, vanilla. Anything that the Republicans could consider, like, big government, oh, it's going to raise taxes. Like, anything meaningful is at stake. Should we keep the filibuster in place? And that's really scary and quite frankly unacceptable. So, there are a few ways. If you are in favor of being like, all right, Madeline, yes, let's fuck up the filibuster. Let's send it to its grave. Like, what do I need to do? I will share this document in my Discord as well as on Twitter. So you can check it out, and it will have all these links so you can use those resources. But you can call your senators and advocate your support for eliminating the filibuster. If you live in California, there's a petition that you can sign. And then Indivisible National also has a democracy reform working group that hosts monthly Zooms. I'm not a member of Indivisible, but some really close friends who are organizers and activists here in the Bay Area are actively involved with Indivisible, and they do a really good job of organizing around these specific issues, like organizing phone banks, giving you talking points and info sheets, fact sheets about everything. So I will make all of that available to you guys if you're interested in potentially getting involved or learning more. But that's my my sweet deck on the history of the filibuster and why we should get the fuck rid of it.